If you have your Bibles, kindly turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 38. Genesis, chapter 38. There are 30 verses in this chapter. Um, Before we begin, I just want to quote one of the Puritan preachers, John Flavel, when he preached a sermon called Navigation Spiritualized. He said something that is memorable, something that is noteworthy. He said, the providence of God is like Hebrew words. It can be read only backwards, and like the Hebrew script, which is read from right to left, God's providence, in Flavel's understanding, is best understood not in the moment of trial or the moment of sin or persecution or temptation or God's provision, not in that moment, not in the moment of crisis, but going down the road looking backwards. So, what is Flavel saying? He's saying God's providence sometimes becomes clearer or makes sense when you look back in hindsight. And Genesis 38, the chapter that we're looking at today, is best understood looking backwards. And you can go right up to the end of the Bible, to the book of Revelation, chapter 5. The context, the scene there is John is greatly distressed that there is nobody who is worthy to open the scrolls, to break the seals. And in verse 4, chapter 5, verse 4, he begins to weep greatly. There's no one who is found worthy to break the seals. And then in chapter 5, verse 5, one of the elders said to me, that is John, who is writing on the island of Patmos, one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Behold, the lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its seven seals. I like what Dr. Austin Duncan says. He says, this is the crowning destiny of the tribe of Judah. It culminates in the lion of the tribe of Judah, and that's none other than the Lord Jesus Christ, presented to us in the book of Revelation, not as an infant in the incarnation in the manger, but as God of very God in exaltation in the future heaven, in the eschaton, the end of all things, as he unfolds human history to bring all glory to himself, as he redeems men from every tribe and tongue and nation, accomplishing all his purposes in the world. This is the cumulative moment in the tribe of Judah. And all this starts, that's the culmination of the tribe of Judah. But it all starts in this dark, twisted tale that is now found in Genesis chapter 38. It's about Judah and Tamar. So Jesus in his human lineage is from the tribe of Judah, as most of us know. And if you look at Matthew chapter 1, verses 13, and if you look at Luke 3:33, in the genealogy that is described, outlined for us over there, you'll read that Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So Judah is mentioned there in the genealogy, both in Matthew that goes back all the way to Abraham, and then in the genealogy in Luke, which goes back all the way to Adam, Judah, and Perez are mentioned. So, you remember the previous chapter, we started the life story of Joseph. Joseph, who was the favorite of his father Jacob, and his father made it quite obvious because he gave him this fancy multicolored coat that went up all the way to his ankles, went up all the way to his wrists, which would then mean that he didn't have to do any physical manual labor. So he was the favorite son of his father. In fact, he had two dreams that we looked at. The one where the sheaves, they were all rounding up the sheaves, and all the sheaves bowed to his sheep. And his brothers were even more infuriated when they heard about his first dream. And then his second dream, where the sun, moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to him. This time, even his father got angry and kind of rebuked him, saying, will your mother and your father bow down to you? The answer, as we know, is yes, because that's what happens at the end of Genesis. But in Genesis chapter 38, the camera pans from the life of Joseph and what's happening to him. The chapter 37 ended with Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery to both the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, who at that time were in the nascent form. So they were a small group. They were going down to Egypt to probably strike a few deals with Egypt, to trade with Egypt, and so they were traveling. And so Joseph's brothers sell him to the Midianites slash Ishmaelites. And now the camera shifts, the focus shifts to Judah and Tamar. So why does it shift to Judah? Some liberal theologians will say, see, this is Moses just wants to add a little spice to the entire narrative in Genesis. That's not the case. The reason it shifts is because there's a contrast between the life of Judah, and then in Genesis chapter 39, the life of Joseph. Also, it's a continuation. And as we just saw, this story also shows us the lineage of the Lord Jesus Christ, that Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, and that connection is made later in the genealogies presented in both Matthew and Luke. And also, there are some teachers who say that this shows us the need for this family, the family of Jacob, to move to Egypt, where they will continue to grow as a nation. So let's start by reading the first 5 verses of Genesis chapter 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went in to her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Shezib when she bore him. So it begins. This is Judah. We're talking about the fourth son of Jacob and Leah. The first son was Reuben, the second was Levi and Simeon. We're talking about the fourth son, Judah, and it begins by saying that he went down off. Often, when the biblical authors use language like this, when they say they went down, it not only refers to the fact that they, on the map geographically, they went down or they went south, but it also could indicate, it could point to the fact that they went down in their spiritual life, and there was a moral decline. I was just reading, meditating on 1 Samuel chapter 3 the other day, and it was talking about how Samuel was there in the house of the Lord. He was ministering to the Lord. And then it talks about Eli's vision that had grown dim, I think in verse 1 or 2 of 1 Samuel 3. His vision grew dim, and the light in the temple was about to go out. And I think that's, the author, there is a metaphorical meaning to that. It's not just a physical description, but it's also indicative of the spiritual vision of both Eli and that time in Israel where visions were very rare, where God rarely spoke to the people, where there was hardly any breakthrough, not because God did not want to speak, but because people were doing what was right in their own eyes in accordance with the book of Judges. And so, very often when you read in the Bible that somebody goes down, it could point to the fact that it's also reflective of their moral character or something that they're about to do. So, Judah went down from his brothers who probably were in Hebron. So he leaves his family and he turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. And so he goes out and he mingles with somebody who he's not supposed to be mingling with. And as I was reading that, I was reminded of 1 Corinthians 15:33, where the Apostle Paul says, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character." And I've been on both sides of the equation. I've been on the side where when you associate with certain bad company, they have the power to influence your own character. And the opposite is also true. If you go and associate with people who are constantly talking about God, then you will be motivated when it comes to your spiritual life. The moral, the lesson is very simple. Just be wise about who you hang out with. When you hang out with people who are morally upright, who are constantly discussing God and how to become more holy, you will be motivated in your own spiritual life. If you go to people who are worldly and constantly are filled with their language, their ideas, their coarse jokes, then you will also tend to follow along and blend in to that culture. So here he goes and he hangs out with this one Adulamite called Hira. And in verse 2, we're told that Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. So Shua was the mother. And then he took her and went into her, and she conceived, and she gave birth to three sons. The name of the first was the second was Onan, and the third was Sheila. But the Hebrew way of pronouncing it, because it was a boy, probably Shaila, not Sheila, because that sounds like a feminine name. So the result of this union, this union between somebody who belonged to the covenant of God, the covenant people of God, and a Canaanite woman, that itself should cause all the alarm bells in our head to go off, because we know how particular Abraham was when he was looking for a wife for his son Isaac. He sent his servant, probably Eliezer, and he goes and he brings Rebecca back, and Isaac gets married to one of Abraham's own, somebody from his own hometown. Same thing when it comes to Jacob getting married. His mother and father decide to send him to the mother's brother's house, Laban's house, and he gets married to both Rachel and Leah. And his parents, that is Jacob was very displeased when his elder son Esau got married to Canaanite woman. But over here we see Judah do exactly that. He gets married to a Canaanite woman, and so he's doing something that is not permitted, something that God's people should not do. The technical term is endogamy. Endogamy means marrying within your own people, your own local community, and that's something that he failed to do over here, and he's going to reap the consequences. There are going to be negative consequences. And so in verse 6, we read, and Judah took a wife for his firstborn. So he gets a wife for his firstborn son, and her name was Tamar. And so these are the two main characters, Judah and Tamar. In this chapter, they are the two main characters. And so the name of his firstborn's wife is Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. So we're not told as to what, why he was wicked or what his wicked deeds were, but we are told that he was wicked and God put him to death. And in one sense, God's hand. I've been thinking about this and doing some research on this, and I've read that when it comes to the death of a person, we sometimes wonder why God allows the death of a certain person. If they, even today, the news came out that a famous celebrity died by falling from the third floor. He formerly was part of a band. I don't think that band exists anymore, called One Direction, and he fell from the third floor somewhere in Argentina. So fell to his death. So we sometimes wonder, have they died prematurely? Would they have died, if they continue because they were outside the will of God? Did God strike them dead? So God's hand, if you think about death and what is God's relation to death, you can say that God causes death in at least three ways. Number one, you can say that God is behind death, or God's hand is behind death in what he permits or what he allows. Um, that is to say that if God can stop, we know that God can stop anybody's death. We know God can prolong anybody's life. So when somebody dies, God's hand is behind the death in the sense that He has allowed it to happen. Whoever is passing away, we know that God has allowed it because He's sovereign, He's in control of everything. And so, in that sense, His hand is behind that person's death. He has allowed it. He's permitted it to happen. However it happened, He allowed it to happen. That's the first way. The second way is God's hand is behind every death in the same, because of the world, the kind of world that He's created. That is, He's created a world with the laws of physics, with the law of cause and effect. Supposing, like the example I just cited, that guy fell down from the third floor. Why did he fall down? Because of gravity. Nobody will say God killed him, but you could say gravity killed him, and gravity was created by God. That is a law that is created by God. And so, whether you jump from a building and you fall to your death, or whether you drive into a concrete wall at 100 kilometers now, all this because of the laws of physics. If you do something careless like that, because of the way God has set up the universe, and because of the way God set up the laws of this world, it could bring about death if somebody is careless or somebody acts irresponsibly. And so, in that sense, also, God is behind every death. And the third thing you can say, God brings about death as a direct result or indirect result of his judgment. Sometimes God may decide to take a life because of his judgment. There are two examples. One is indirect in the Old Testament. You have Achan in the book of Joshua who stole from God, and God says he must be put to death, but God doesn't kill him directly. He tells them to carry out his death through the judicial process, and so indirectly God causes his death. But that's a direct judgment of God. In the New Testament, we all know the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, where God directly causes their death and he purges the church of its uncleanness, its hypocrisy, to make an example of both of them. And so, in that sense, God's hand is behind every single death, but in different ways. Sometimes in what He allows and what He permits. Sometimes because of the cause and effect that the laws, the cause and effect laws, and sometimes it's a direct result of His judgment. So, one thing is important. One thing that is important is that we don't we don't assume we don't presume to know which one is a direct judgment of God and which one it's very difficult to tell where God has directly judged somebody or where they have just died because of the way the world is set up. So it's difficult to figure out. But here we're clearly told in this verse that I just read about God directly killed him because of his wickedness. We don't know how exactly because that's all the verse says. It just states it. It's very matter of fact. Because of his wickedness, was put to death. Then in verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother in law to take her and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So, because of what is called the Levirate law, which was codified much later. But just like how God told his people to carry out sacrifices and he gave them many instructions, including things like tithing. We read that story of Abraham and Melchizedek and how Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. So there are a lot of things that God instructed his people much before the law was given in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy. When you read the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, this law is mentioned, the Levirate law. And if you want a story of where it's played out, you can read the book of Ruth, the 4 chapters over there. We hear of the kinsman redeemer Boaz. But here itself, we get before the law was codified, before it was organized, before it was given to Moses and to the people of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25. In fact, let me read that verse so that we understand what this law is. Deuteronomy 25:5 says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of her husband's brother to her. That's the Levirate law. And supposing the wife approaches, this widow approaches the brother of the late husband and he refuses to marry her, then she can take up the matter with the elders. This is all as you continue to read Deuteronomy 25 verses 6 to 10. And then the elders will have a talk with the brother, and if he still refuses to marry her, then the widow is called in front of all the elders, and she will remove his sandal and she will spit on his face, and then from that point on he will be known as the head of the family of the unsandaled. So that is some form of humiliation, and that's the reason God made this law is so that that widow is protected and provided for in that culture. She would have been very vulnerable in that culture, in that patriarchal society, and so God made this law, the Levirate law, as a form, as a way, as a means of providing for her and protecting her because she would have been very vulnerable. So that's exactly what Judah asks Onan to do. He asks him to carry out his responsibility as the brother of the firstborn. But Onan doesn't do that. We're told over here that he spilt his semen on the floor. So he only uses her for the sexual gratification part, but does not carry out the responsibility that he should be carrying out. So, this is where the technical term is coitus interruptus, and many people have misapplied these few verses that I just read, verses 8, 9, and 10, to say that the Bible does not permit things like birth control. But as one preacher said it wasn't that. It's not these few verses are not talking about family planning. The sin was family plotting. He didn't want to produce an heir who would inherit everything, because he knew that his Onan knew that if he had a son, then that son would technically not be his, but it would be the son of his brother, and his name will continue, and all, and then he'll be the firstborn, and then he'll inherit everything, and then he'll be richer and he will be better, and because he would be heirs, as one preacher says it. So because of that, he decides not to do that. But his sin is nothing to do with birth control, as some people make it out to be. His sin is to do with selfishness and not carrying on the responsibility, which is why God gets angry with him and strikes him dead too. In fact, Donald Gray Barnhouse once preached a sermon on all the people that God struck dead in the Bible, and every time he said that, he would hit the pulpit every time he struck somebody dead, and it really reminds us of the holiness of God. And when we read it, it also reminds us of his patience and his long suffering towards us. I mean, there were times in the Bible where God struck somebody dead, and I've cited a few examples like Achan and Onan here, and his brother Ur, and Ananias and Sapphira. So it reminds us of how holy God is, and at the same time, with people like us, his long suffering towards us, his patience towards us. Because if he were to act in the same way that he did with all these people, then many of us would have been struck dead. One preacher gives the example of how sometimes we sing that song, I surrender all, but do we really surrender all? Because if God were to act like he did in the Old Testament, and a few examples in the New Testament as well, then many people, as they sing that song, I surrender all, would be struck dead by God, because we're really not surrendering all, but we're happily singing that song. So, in light of that, we're grateful to God for his long suffering, the fact that he is slow to anger, that he's abounding in love, and that he's so patient with us, all of us who are a work in progress. So, that is something that we ought to be grateful for. But in this case, God, their wickedness did not please God, because they were trying to interrupt God's plans. And so God strikes both these brothers dead. Both the sons of Judah are dead. And then we go to verse 11. In verse 11, then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter in law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brother. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. It is the responsibility of her father in law to provide for her another man to get married to. And so he says, you go back to your father in law's house, because at this point, he gives the excuse saying that you wait for Sheila to grow up, and then when he's a grown man, you can get married to him. But he had no intention of actually giving Sheila, because at this point he's worried that that Tamar is probably cursed, or she's some sort of unlucky charm or something. And if he gives his third son, then his only son, who will probably continue his name and his line, will also perish, just like his two elder brothers. And so he had no intention of giving, and he was going to deceive her. He had subterfuge in mind, and so he just makes up an excuse for the time being, saying, go back to your father's house, and when he's grown up, then you can get married to him. Then in verses, let me read a few more verses, that is verses 12 to 19. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, your father in law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter in law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, taking off her veil, and she put on the garments of her widowhood. So the temple prostitution was a common form of worship in the Canaanite culture, and the Canaanites got many converts through luring many people through their temple prostitutes, because it was a form of worship. And they said, if you come and sleep with some of the temple prostitutes, then you have converted to the Canaanite religion and the worship of their gods. And that wasn't really Tamar's intention. Her intention was to receive the family inheritance and to continue the line, the family name. And so she disguises herself to be a prostitute. And Judah, after he loses his wife, that is Shua's daughter. I think her name was Aliat, but it's not mentioned over here. But that is Shua's daughter. When he loses his wife, he is then comforted. Then he goes up to Timnah, and there he looks for a prostitute, and he finds um, uh, this girl who's disguised. He doesn't know that it's his own daughter-in-law, and he goes into her, and then he asks her, what do you want? And she says, "What will you give me?" And he says, "I'll give you a young goat." But he is not carrying a goat around with him. So she says, "What will you give me as a pledge?" And she says, "You give me a signet ring and your cord and your staff." Now, a signet ring, those days, it was something like a credit card, where you can put in wax. It'll probably have some initials, or some way of identifying who it belonged to, and you can put it in wax, and you can sign letters, or you can buy purchase things. So she asked for three things: the signet ring, she asked for the cord, and for the staff. So all these things that would be easily discernible as belonging to Judah. And so she asks for this, and so he gives it to her until he can bring the goat and give it to her as a payment for her services. And so then she rose away and went away, taking off her veil and putting on the garments of her widowhood. And then we're told in verses 20 to 23, and when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also, the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." So in the Canaanite culture, they had this thing, and it came from Mesopotamia, the place where Abraham originally was from. They had these cult prostitutes and it was all about fertility. So sometimes when the farmers, before harvesting the crops, they would go and sleep with this temple prostitutes, which was supposed to be a recreation of the marriage between the goddess Ishtar and the divine deities. And the hope was that either the flocks, before the flocks mated, or before the harvest season came around, that they would have, it would be a very fertile crop, or they would have or the flocks would be very fertile, and so they would go and sleep with these cult prostitutes. That's where they got this idea. And so now he's come back to give this cult prostitute, or so he thought, the price that she had asked for, which was a young goat. That was the bargain. That's what that was the deal that they struck. And so he comes back to find her, and he informs a few people, but nobody is able to find her, because she that wasn't an actual profession. That was just a disguise that she put on for a while. And so nobody is able to find her, because she's gone back. She's put on her old clothes, the clothes of a widow, and so nobody is able to locate her. And so Judah quickly hushes it up. He doesn't want to make a big deal of it. He doesn't want to go public saying I'm on a quest for this cult prostitute, because he knows that he'll be laughed at, and he knows that it'll bring him and his family a bad name. So he says, let her keep those three things that she took away. That is the signet ring, the cord, and his staff. That would have been Judah's staff. Everybody would have known it was Judah's staff. He said, let her just keep it. About, verse 24 says, about 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter in law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. Look what Judah says. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father in law. She said, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And as she said, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not know her again. And so it's, if you read verse 24, it's quite a cruel way to execute somebody. As soon as Judah hears of the fact that his daughter-in-law Tamar has not listened to his instructions and she's been immoral, now she's found to be pregnant at 3 months, she's probably showing. And so he says, bring her out, let her be burned. It's amazing how bad our sins look on others. It's amazing how bad our sins look on others. He was guilty of literally the same sin. He also sought out a prostitute. He also slept with a prostitute. Now, when he finds out that she has played the harlot and she's become pregnant, look at the judgment he pronounces on her. Immediate, quickly, without taking any time to consider what the implications are, he says, death sentence. He pronounces a death sentence, and he says, quite a cruel one. He says, let her be brought out and burned. And at that point, she pulls out her trump card, so to speak, where she says, okay, and I like the way William C. Kaiser describes this entire scene. He says, the companions of Judah bring him word that his daughter in law Tamar has played the harlot. His judgment is quick and decisive. Let her be burned. There is neither hesitation nor compromise as he utters this fearful sentence. We cannot detect even a tremor in his voice. The society must be preserved from such folly and wickedness. The word goes out, the day is fixed, the preparations go forward, the stake is planted, the pile is arranged, the procession forms, the crowd gathers, the woman walks to her apparent doom, but she bears in her hands the tokens, the pledges are with her, she carries the staff and the ring, and the staff is the staff of Judah, and the ring is his ring. The pledges become the accusation of her judge. The pledges become the accusation of her judge. What weight will his sentence have now? And so there's a dramatic turn of events, and while her sentence is about to be carried out, she brings out all this evidence that shows that he is the one who is impregnated her. And I'm sure this entire story also reminds you of King David, and how when Nathan the prophet confronted him with that parable, he tells that story of that rich man who has all the flock in the world, and there's this poor man also who dwells in that same city. Nathan tells David this parable, and then he says, one day when the rich man had a guest, this poor man had only one ewe lamb. The rich man has a guest. The rich man, instead of taking a lamb from his own flock, and he had plenty of them, he slaughters the poor man's lamb. And so when David hears that story, he's livid, he's infuriated, and he says that man must surely be put to death. And then Nathan points his prophetic finger at David and says, you are that man. Very similar story here in Genesis chapter 38, where Judah is now exposed. He says, let her be burned. And then she comes and says, there's a turn of events, and she says, you're the man who impregnated me, because she has the evidence, she has all the different pledges. And so he rightly and humbly at this point says, she is more righteous than I. In contrast, she is more righteous because she only wanted to further the line. She wanted what was rightfully hers, and she learned that he deceived her, because when his son Shelah grew up, he did not give him to her in marriage. And so she no she does what She does the only thing out of desperation that she knows, and that is to trick her own father-in-law into lying with her. And in that way, she continues the family line. Now, we finish the chapter, verses 27 to 30. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she saw, when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as she drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Zerah. So interesting. Ironically, Judah lost two sons, but now he has two sons because she has twins. They were twins, and first, we're told that the child that put out his hand first, the midwife put a scarlet thread, but then again the other child comes out first, and then and his name Perez, which literally means breakthrough or breach. So Perez happens to be the one who continues the family line, and then is also mentioned in the genealogy both in Matthew 1 and Luke 3. So here is a chapter, as I said earlier, where many liberal scholars say that, oh, Moses just added it, but we know that it's here to show. First of all, it's placed here because we're going to see in the following week, we'll see Genesis 39, and it's there to contrast two lives, the life of Judah and his brother Joseph. We know what Joseph will do, and his faithfulness and his commitment to God in Genesis chapter 39, and it's contrasted with what Judah does over here. And the second reason is also to show that the Messiah is going to come through this line, through the line of Judah. If you read Genesis chapter 49, Jesus is from the line of Judah, and the scepter will not depart, the rod will not depart. And so it's a story of how God in his grace, how God in his sovereignty, how God in his providence decides to bring the Messiah out of this very messed up line. We know that Reuben was disqualified, Simeon, Levi were disqualified, but then he chose this tribe. And if you look later, and it's a little bit of a spoiler alert, if you look later in the book of Genesis, Judah does come around. This is probably a very defining moment in his life where he says, "You are more righteous than me." And later, he's the one, we know Judah is the one who sold his brother Joseph into slavery. And he says, "Why murder him? Let's make some money." And he sells Joseph to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. Later, and I think Genesis chapter 44, we'll see Judah having that moment of repentance, but we'll come to that a little bit later. So he comes full circle. He does change, and God does do a work in his life, and it is from his tribe. He's the head of the tribe of Judah. From his tribe comes the Messiah, the Lion of Judah, Jesus himself, as we saw in Revelation chapter 5, the one who is worthy to open the scroll, to break the seal. So that is Genesis chapter 38, verses 1 to 30.